Ladies and gentlemen, good evening to all of you, and I would like to welcome you all to this distinguished evening in which we receive a distinguished thinker who has significant contributions in the various disciplines of social sciences, starting from sociology to international relations. And being from an international relations background, I see the most contribution of our guest this evening is associated with his world famous world system theory of since a century approximately post First World War in the sociology to the liberalism and its branches till Immanuel Wallerstein, who has established a theory in international relations. And I believe all those interested in this discipline of knowledge realize the fact of his contributions in his world famous theory, which is we indicated to the center and periphery, and its ability to explain the major shifts in the international system. I would like to welcome Professor Immanuel Wallerstein, who is beyond any introductions that I may even attempt to do, and I would like to call upon him to start his session. We will allocate to him 35 minutes approximately, and the rest of the session would be dedicated for discussion. Doctor, the floor is yours.
Well, I'm very honored to have been invited. I'm very honored to have been invited to make this distinguished lecture and to talk on a theme which I know is important to you. I'm going to start with a headline of a long story in the New York Times about 10 days ago, and I will read you the headline. Conflicting policies on Syria and Islamic State erode U.S. standing in the Middle East. Now, that story, of course, was particularly about Syria, but it reflects a much larger issue, much larger than just what is happening in Syria today. I have not met most of you before this weekend, but I will bet that almost all of you are unsure about what U.S. policy is and will be. You find it very difficult to predict, and it worries you. And that's quite understandable, but I'm going to try to explain how we have come to that situation. The decline of the United States as a hegemonic power is not something, it's something to which many of you have referred, but it's not something that started a couple of years ago. I myself wrote an article in 1980, which appeared in Foreign Policy, in which I discussed U.S. decline. So, decline from what? From being the hegemonic power. Now, we use that term rather loosely, but I have a very clear meaning in my mind as to what it is to be a hegemonic power. A hegemonic power is a power that can get its way 95% of the time on 95% of the issues. That's a rare situation. It's only happened 3 times in the whole history of the modern world system, and each time it lasted relatively briefly, somewhat like 25 years. The U.S. was a hegemonic power, right? between 1945, more or less, and 1970, more or less. At that point of time, it was the deciding power in the world system. Now, you will say it was a bipolar situation. No, it was a truly unipolar situation, and we have to talk, therefore, about the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a very strong military power. It was presumably ideologically at odds with the United States. There was, in fact, a tacit deal between the United States and the Soviet Union arrived at in the early 40s, and that is that the Soviet Union would have its way in approximately 1/3 of the world, more or less from what we later called East Germany to East Asia. And the United States would have its way in the other 2/3 of the world. And here's the deal. The deal was that neither the one nor the other would try in any way to change those boundaries. And in fact, this was, of course, reinforced by the fact that they both had nuclear weapons and there was the possibility of mutually assured destruction. Okay? If you look at the boundaries as of 1989 and compare them with the boundaries as of 1945, you will see that they were unchanged. There were many moments of tension, but the end of those tensions was always a return to the status quo ante. Now, this was an agreement largely in order to enforce a certain stability on the world system and a certain status quo. Now, you will say, but there was a Cold War. And I say to you, notice the word cold. There was a Cold War, yes. They screamed and yelled at each other. They denounced each other. But they didn't take any action that would change those boundaries. Now, there were lots of people who didn't like this stability, this freezing of the world system. And we have right away a number of rebellions in what is then called the Third World. The first was China. The Chinese Communist Party was strongly advised by Stalin to make a deal with the Kuomintang, and they said, sorry, we're not interested in that. We're going to march on Shanghai, and we're going to proclaim the People's Republic, which is what they did. The Viet Minh in Vietnam were strongly advised. There was a conference that froze Vietnam into two halves, and they said, we're not interested in that. We're going to march on Saigon. And they did. The Algerian liberation movement, the Front de Libération Nationale, was strongly advised by the French Communist Party, who felt they came under their aegis, that they should wait on anything concerning self-government until the French Communist Party had realized the success of the class struggle. And they said, sorry, we're not interested, we're going ahead. And they not only went ahead, they, of course, as you know, achieved independence. And in Cuba, the group around Fidel Castro, who overthrew the government of Batista, a government supported by the Cuban Communist Party, right? What they did was they adopted the name of Cuban Communist Party, ousting these other fellows, and therefore forced the Soviet Union to help them defend themselves against U.S. invasion. So these things shook the status quo. What also shook the status quo was the war in Vietnam. The United States, of course, went in after the French were forced out, And they went in to win the war, to defeat the Viet Minh. In point of fact, they discovered that wasn't all that easy. The Vietnam War was a disaster for the United States. First of all, it wrecked the economy. The U.S. had to go off the gold standard. It had to change. It was very costly for the United States, but it was also costly in terms of the political internal situation in the United States. At that point in time, the United States had a mandatory draft of all young men coming of a certain age. And these, of course, included middle-class students who didn't relish dying in Vietnam. And they rebelled, and the rebellion grew, and eventually the United States had to pull out of Vietnam. They lost a war. You have to get that clear in your mind. The United States lost a war against Vietnam and had to leave in rather desperate circumstances. And as a result, they changed many things. They eliminated the draft, for example, so that they would never have this again. We have something called the Vietnam Syndrome, a reluctance of United States citizens to get into another war, a reluctance that remains to this day. Around that time, there was something called, I call it anyway, the World Revolution of 1968. It was a world revolution in that it took place in all three worlds, as they called them at the time. There was uprisings within the Soviet world. There were uprisings within the pan-European world, that is Western Europe, North America, Australasia, and there were uprisings in what was then called the Third World. And if you look at what the themes of the World Revolution, there were common themes across all three worlds. And one common theme was, we are against U.S. imperialism and its attempt to dominate the world, and we're against Soviet collusion with U.S. imperialism. That was constantly said in one way or another all through the three worlds. And the second common theme was, you know, there are all these movements which are old left movements. They're the communist parties who dominated the Soviet world. They're the social democratic parties who in one way or another dominated the pan-European world. I incidentally consider New Deal Democrats in the United States as social democrats who didn't want to call themselves social democrats. And there were rebellions against the national liberation movements in all the countries where they had come to power. And what they all said about these movements is, you promised us a two-step strategy. You said, first, we have to come to state power, and secondly, we'll change the world. And they said, you know, you've all come to state power, but you haven't changed the world. You haven't changed the world. It's as bad economically as it was before. It's as bad politically. It's maybe even worse. And you haven't abolished classes. You just call them something else. You call them the nomenclatura. But that's the same thing as the bourgeoisie. So they rejected the old left. Okay? At this point, the U.S. was in difficulty as of 1970, quite clearly. And the U.S., noticing that its relative power, that it couldn't get its way 95% of the time on 95% of the issues anymore, right? So it was in a process of slow decline. And the U.S. presidents decided to do something to slow down the decline. And all the presidents, starting with Richard Nixon and ending with Bill Clinton, and including Ronald Reagan, followed the same basic foreign policy. Right? It consisted of three things. It consisted of saying on the U.S. Side to their satellites, which were Western Europe and Canada and Australasia, they said, we'll promote you. You're no longer satellites. You are now our partners. We will make common decisions about what we should do in the world. We'll create institutions like the G7 and the, what do you call it, I've forgotten the name of the institution, a whole series of institutions, including the global economic, the Davos meeting. And we will allow you to participate with us and make common decisions, and you can be more independent, provided you don't go too far. And in fact, they became more independent and did all sorts of things that the U.S. disapproved of, like the Ostpolitik of the West German government, like the building of the pipeline from Russia or Soviet Union to Western Europe, which even Mrs. Thatcher approved of, right? All these things the U.S. was quite unhappy with, but it wasn't too far. And the second thing the U.S. did was to say developmentalism. Everybody had been a developmentalist. The United Nations had proclaimed the 70s the decade of development. They just used slightly different languages, but the idea of developmentalism, of some kind of inward construction of industries with an attempt to build a middle class, to urbanize, etc. This was going on everywhere in the 50s and 60s, and all of a sudden the U.S. said, no, the end of that, you're no longer developmentalist, you're now going to be oriented to export production, and we're going to enforce this through something called neoliberalism, and we're going to have the International Monetary Fund tell you that if you're in economic difficulty, which all of them were at this point, if you want loans and so forth, you have to do a whole series of things, which we call the Washington Consensus. And that also made sure that a reasonable amount of world surplus value was still flowing to the United States and secondarily to Western Europe. And the third thing that they all agreed on was no nuclear proliferation. Well, one has to say, no nuclear proliferation? Well, the concept was, yes, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, that's a reality. We have to accept that. But no more. Now, no more was a serious issue because at that time there were some 20-odd countries that were in the process of developing nuclear weapons. And 4 of them refused to sign the treaty. I mean, you know which 4 it is. It was Israel, India, Pakistan, and South Africa. And they all developed nuclear weapons. But anyway, it did slow it down because the other 15 or 16 did abandon their programs. And the end of developmentalism did mean that a reasonable amount of money was still flowing into the Western world. And the limitations on how far countries would go to be independent of the U.S. did work. So you could say it was a half success, okay? And as I say, even Reagan was playing that game. And if you don't believe me, just see Dick Cheney, who was his Minister of Defense, or Secretary of Defense in the United States, and who later became Vice President, who admitted in 2003 that he disapproved of Reagan's policies because, in fact, they were in this line. Okay? Then came the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, the collapse of the Soviet Union came about for the same reason that lots of governments in Asia, Africa, and Latin America were collapsing in the 80s. They were collapsing because of the stagnation in the world economy, the fact that they needed these loans, and they just dropped their policies and gave in. And in a sense, the Soviet Union was the last and the least imaginably likely to give in. It gave in, and the U.S., in fact, did not welcome that. If you look at U.S. policy from about 1987 to 1989, they were not pushing the breakup of the Soviet Union. Quite the contrary. Why? Because the Cold War was never meant to be won. It was meant to go on indefinitely. And what was the advantage of the Cold War to the United States? That, first of all, it ensured a kind of military stability in the world system. But more important than that, right, it ensured that the Soviet Union and the United States would each keep their side under control and not have them do anything foolish that would endanger the entente between the United States and the Soviet Union. And if the Soviet Union were to disappear, that role of the Soviet Union would disappear with it. Well, they were right. The first major consequence of the collapse of the Soviet Union was the invasion of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein. Look, Iraq had been for, 80 or 100 years complaining about the fact that Kuwait really should be part of them, that it was a nasty British trick, and so forth. So it wasn't a new idea. What was new was their ability to do something about it. And the ability to do something about it was that the Soviet Union wasn't there to say, you can't do something about it because that endangers our relationship with the United States. So he invaded Kuwait. That had a lot of virtues from his point of view, including the fact that he wouldn't have to pay back the debt to Kuwait, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know all the reasons why he did it. And President Bush hesitated in his response to that. And he had a phone call, we know now, from Mrs. Thatcher, who said, this is no time to be wobbly, George. So he went in. But even going in showed the weakness of the United States. First of all, the United States couldn't pay for it. Imagine you're the hegemonic power and you can't pay for a war. 90% of the cost of the war was paid for by Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Germany, and Japan. That's a serious indictment of the power of the United States, right? And in addition, we have the question of, all right, we're in, how far do we go? And George H.W. Bush made the decision, against the advice of some others, like these military commanders, we will not go a march on Baghdad. We will be happy to stop at the border and restore the sovereignty of Kuwait. It's probably a wise decision, but it made a number of people very unhappy. Why? Because it left Saddam Hussein in political power, and that, they said in the United States, was a humiliation to the United States. Finally, The war in the first Gulf War was, of course, another disaster in that we had supported, the United States had supported, as you all know, Iraq in the 80s in their war against Iran, right? What we did was we removed from power the two military groups that were giving Iran the most difficulty. One was Saddam Hussein, and the other were the Taliban in Afghanistan. So in a sense, we wiped out the most immediate enemies. Iran was, in fact, the great beneficiary of the first Gulf War. Then came George W. Bush to power in 2001, and as you know, was followed by 9/11, which was a rather traumatic experience for the United States. After all, the United States had never, ever been bombed. Never. During the whole Second World War, the United States wasn't bombed, right? And within hours, the neocon coterie around George W. Bush said, this was done by Saddam Hussein, and we have to use this as the moment to overcome our weakness and show the world that we are really a hegemonic power, right? And we'll do it alone if we have to. We don't even need anyone else. We're going to go in immediately and we're going to overthrow Saddam Hussein. Now, that turned out to be not so easy. In the first place, the decision of the United States to overthrow Saddam Hussein led to the 2003 meeting of the Security Council, the first time ever in the history of the United Nations that the United States lost a vote in the Security Council. They only had 4 votes out of 15. They withdrew the motion because they were so embarrassed by this. But think of that. They lost a vote in the Security Council. Secondly, they discovered by going into Iraq that yes, they could march in. The Iraqi army couldn't stop them, but the resistance was real, a resistance to United States presence. And it took many forms and went on for a long time. In fact, one could say it's still going on today. So, as you look at this picture and you say, what happened in the Bush regime? You say, here's a group who said the United States was humiliated. Here's our moment for revenge. Here's our moment to reassert ourselves. Here's our moment to be macho militarist, right? It backfired. It backfired completely. And it changed what was a slow decline into a precipitate decline. Actually, George W. Bush realized this by 2006. That's what he did. He fired his Secretary of Defense. He marginalized Cheney, and he tried to return to the Clinton doctrine. What was the Clinton doctrine? Work with your allies, discuss, partnership, right? He didn't succeed. He bequeathed it to his successor, Barack Obama, who continued and continues to this day the same policy. This is the attempt to return to the Clinton doctrine, okay? But it's too late. It's not returnable. It's not reversible. Right? Now, where does that leave us today? why do you have headlines like that in the New York Times? Well, I'll tell you. And here you use the metaphor of the loose cannon. I don't know if you know where this metaphor comes from, but in the 18th century, on the major military boats in the Western world, the cannons were attached to the dock, the top level, right? They were attached, and that was how you shot at other boats. And under certain circumstances, because of exceptional winds or because something else happened, the cannons got loose. That's where the metaphor loose cannon comes from. The cannons got loose, they broke away from their stable thing, and then they rolled across the deck. And as they rolled across the deck, anything could happen. It could turn the whole ship over, it could hit people. It was unpredictable. A loose cannon is something that's unpredictable, but is also extremely dangerous to itself and to others. Now that's where we are today. The United States is a loose cannon, and you all know that. So you react in the same way. You say, I'm not going to wait on the U.S. to tell me what to do. Even the closest allies of the United States, like Saudi Arabia, like Israel, are making their own decisions. They hear the U.S. They don't want to irritate it because it's still the strongest military power in the world, but it's a military power that can do damage. It can't solve the problems. It's too late. It doesn't have the armed forces, and it doesn't have the money. Yes, it has armies, but they have to go on the ground, and there's that Vietnam syndrome. The U.S. population loves it to be the leader of the world, but they don't want to pay the price. So they zigzag. They zigzag all the time, and there's no reliability in what the United States will do. As a result, you all take your independent decisions, kind of trying to make sure that the United States isn't too irritated because it's a loose cannon and it can do nasty things, but you can still take your own decisions. I want you to compare this in your own mind with 1956. 1956, right? Two things happened in 1956, right? There was the Suez War, right? France, Britain, and Israel entered Egypt to more or less to open the Suez Canal and probably to overthrow the government. And the U.S., for various reasons, was unhappy with that. That was the same year that the rebellion occurred in Hungary, and the Soviet Union was unhappy about that. Did the United States and the Soviet Union help the other people? Not at all. The United States did nothing about Hungary. That was the Soviets' business. It was in their territory. And the United States just picked up the phone and told the British, French, and Israelis, get out immediately. And they got out immediately. They had to obey the United States. That's hegemony. That's hegemony. And can you imagine today the United States calling up Britain, France, and Israel and saying, get out from whatever they were doing? Not a chance in a million years. So the end result of all of this is that we're in an extremely dangerous situation. Loose cannons are dangers to themselves and to all the others. And since none of us know what's going to happen next week or next year, are totally unsure, we're unsure about what we should do. And that makes us all extremely nervous, which is very understandable. So I think I can leave you with this optimistic ending. Thank you.
I would like to thank Mr. Immanuel for this valuable lecture that has reminded us of some facts throughout the 50 previous years and had tackled other ideas such as the idea of the hegemony of the United States of America throughout the war. There was no bilateral regime, there was a unilateral regime. He has talked as well about the decline of the United States force, especially after the Second World War, and then it has continued its decline until it reached. Just make sure that he's listening. And he talked about the unilateralism of Mr. George W. Bush, and then the attempt to go back to multilateralism during the second mandate of second term of George W. Bush, and reaching the days I'm talking. I think the most important ideas that we can mention this evening, I think Dr. Immanuel has tackled several points that can trigger discussion about the decline of the role of the United States of America, and it is no longer a hegemonous power, especially after the Second World War. So, in what stage are we today? His theory says that there are some central powers when it comes to the international system, and there are these satellite countries and the quasi-satellite countries, and would the United States become outside of the center of the world powers? How about the rising powers in East Asia? Where would the position of the status of other countries like Turkey, Iran in this region? I will open the floor for discussions, for questions, and I will have some questions addressed to Mr. Immanuel, and then we will proceed with other questions afterwards. Please be brief because we have a lot of questions, and
thank you very much for
we
your
will
valuable,
leave room for
informative
everyone.
issues. You said the United States is a loose cannon, and you mentioned the dangers of such situation. Do you think in the future the allies of the United States in the region will continue the course with the United States, or they have to have another path with their relation, taking into consideration as well the economic partnership between the two parties? Thank you.
Find somebody to fix this.
Yes.
تفضل إذا سمحت.
Yeah, last year Michael Hudson wrote an article, Asia Rising, America Declining. And at the end, as a conclusion, he said that neither China nor India can play the role or can fill the place of the United States. They are only free riders. Do you agree? Thank you.
طيب حأخذ أيضا دكتور خالد تفضل.
what do you think the main factor behind the U.S. The power decline in power? And the second question is, what's the logic between the strategic cooperation between the United States and Israel, and do you think that's contributing to preserving its status as the main power or as hegemonic power, or is it the other way? Thank you.
إذا السؤال بالإنجليزي ما في حاجة للسماعة معنا.
You've mentioned that
بدي حدا يصلح هذا يا أخي الرجل سمعه قليل.
you've mentioned the hegemonic powers of the U.S. in '56 with Great Britain, Israel, and France. But don't you agree that in parallel, the France, Great Britain, and even Israel and Egypt have declined along with the U.S. since? There's like, what I'm trying to say, that don't you agree there's a decline in parallel with the satellites or even partners or allies? So, like Israel of Golda Meir is not the Israel of Netanyahu today, as much as the US of Eisenhower is not the US of Obama. So, yeah. Even France of Hollande is not France of Mitterrand. So the decline is also with the satellites and the partners, which makes the decline of the US not that significant, because the others are declining as well. Thank you.
طيب هاخذ فقط سؤال أخير دكتور صادق إذا سمحت، ويا ريت تعرفون عن أنفسكم قبل السؤال.
I'll make it short. Sadiq al-Faqih, Arab Thought Forum. Also, the US has been described recently as a super tank driven by a small-minded soldier. It has a destructive power, but can do very little when it comes to arranging the situations in our today's world. My question is about the unification of Europe. Is it a plus or a minus to the hegemonic power of the United States? You haven't mentioned anything about Europe, the continent getting unified. Thank you.
طيب أنا حأعطيه معلش إذا سمحتوا حأكتفي بهذول الأسئلة حأعطيه فرصة يجاوب.
I will give Mr. Immanuel the opportunity to answer before moving to new questions.
Well, I'm not sure I caught all of your questions, but let me try. Is it a plus or a minus? I'll take the last question first. Is it a plus or a minus to be a hegemonic power? Yes, it's a big plus, actually. First of all, you do very well economically. Secondly, your people do very well economically, and your industries do very well economically. There's a rent that comes with being the hegemonic power. But that leads us to another question, which is, well, then why do they decline? They don't want to decline, right? The decline is not something that is a matter of willpower. It's a matter of structure. What happens is, if you're the hegemonic power, you have a lot of advantages. Other people see that you have all these advantages. They would like to have the same advantage, right? So they strengthen themselves in various ways. Look, let's take the United States as a hegemonic power in the 50s, okay? And it had satellites. Western Europe were satellites. They furthermore, they were in economic difficulty, enormous. There was starvation in Europe in the late 40s. Huh? There were very strong communist parties in the Western European countries. There were all sorts of things. And the U.S. said, okay, there's no point in our being the most efficient producer in the world system so that we can undersell anybody else. We've got to have customers. So we've got to build up these countries to be our customers and also to maintain their loyalty. So we have something we call the Marshall Plan. Now, the Marshall Plan, right, was sold to the U.S. Congress on the grounds that it was anti-communist, right? That this was the way to defeat the Soviet Union. But in fact, they sent all this money, right, to Western Europe. They did the same thing with Japan. They didn't call it the Marshall Plan, but they, in fact, invested a lot of money in Japan in order to turn it into a good customer and a loyal ally, okay? Well, if you do that for 10 or 15 years, something happens. In 1950, key industry at the time was automobiles. In 1950, the United States could sell its automobiles in Germany, France, Britain, and Japan at prices lower than they could produce it for themselves, okay? Including the fact that we had to transport it. By the mid-1960s, the whole thing had reversed. All of a sudden, Japanese and German cars were being sold in the United States, underselling U.S. producers in the United States, okay? So all of a sudden, one of the great strengths of the United States was undermined by the very process of trying to maintain it. That's what happens to hegemonic powers. Second thing is the Vietnam War. If you look at how the United States became the hegemonic power in its 30-year struggle with Germany to succeed Britain as the old hegemonic power, right? One of the ways they did it was they did not invest in the military. U.S. spent almost no money before 1939-40 on military equipment or military forces, right? They invested all their money in the economy. And that's how you become a hegemonic power. But once you're a hegemonic power, the military role is yours. You don't choose it. You've got to maintain the order that you're creating in the world system. So you do things like going into war in Vietnam. But you go into war in Vietnam, and that hurts you, actually, and it reduces your power. Furthermore, you never win wars completely, right? The most credible thing is to threaten war. Threatening war gets you a lot. Fighting a war always turns out to be less than 100% victory. It's an 80% victory, a 60% victory, but there's losses, right? At which point countries look at you and they say, oh, it's maybe we could defy the United States. Maybe they're not so strong. So all these things come into play, and within about 25 years, you're no longer able to get your way 95% of the time on 95% of the issues. And you move into the pattern I described of a slow decline and then a precipitate decline, and that then brings me to a third question. Can China and India fill the gap? Yes and no. First of all, they're far from being strong enough I mean, they're doing quite well economically, relatively to the Western world. But, you know, these big growth spurts, they only last for a certain while. The Soviet Union had a big growth spurt in the 50s. They really did. And they had rates that were 8 or 10%, and then they went down, right? That's a regular phenomenon. So China and India today look very good economically. Will they look so good 15, 20 years from now? Probably not. They will not have 6 or 8 or 10% or whatever they have now, right? They'll be like 2%, like other people. That's the first thing to say. Secondly, can there be a successor hegemon? Yes, there can. It takes quite a while. Actually, the 3 previous hegemons, right, all took 75 to 100 years at least to become an undisputed hegemonic power. It's not that easy, it's not that fast, okay? So if the world system were to go on in its present form, it might be that in the year 2020, 2120 or 2140, we might suddenly see China or East Asia, maybe China plus Japan plus Korea in a sort of union of some kind as the new hegemonic power. But that then brings us to another question. Will the world system, as a world system, survive for another? I don't think so, actually. That's another lecture. I'm not going to give you that lecture. I'll tell you where you can find it, right? I've just put out a book, a year ago actually, in the United States called Does Capitalism Have a Future? It's a book written by 5 historical sociologists, all of whom agree that there's a major problem in the world system at the moment. They disagree on what is likely to happen. So it's a kind of debate among them. I have a chapter in which I explain why I think capitalism won't be around anymore as a world system after about 2040, 2050. I'm not going to give you the arguments now. It's a long case. And this book is being translated into Arabic by, I wrote it down, the Arab scientific publishers in Beirut are translating it. When it comes out, I'm not sure, within a year at most, anyway.
Thank you. هاخذ بضع أسئلة من هذا تفضل دكتور.
I'd like to thank the professor for the most interesting presentation I personally have heard over the last 2 days. Presentation full of strategic insight and logical thoughts. The issues I want to ask about is when I first saw the title of the presentation, I said, which power is the professor going to be talking about? Military power, economic power, other powers? But you clarify the situation as the hegemonic power, which is very, very different to any
What
other
kind of power?
elements.
Hegemonic power.
Yeah. You mentioned the Vietnam syndrome. Do you believe since the year 2003 there is such a thing in American society as the Iraq syndrome? And finally, you mentioned the States, the USA, as loose cannon. Is it really loose cannon or more like chastened cannon, a more controlled cannon? Thank you.
دكتور تفضل. تفضل.
Yeah. You want me to answer that?
Take more questions.
Okay.
As everybody here knows, the most important issue for us is the situation with Israel, whether it is US-Israel situation or Arab-Israel situation. There's a very unclear vision of who is serving who. The US serving Israel, protecting it and keeping it, or Israel serving the US by being in this region. Now, if the US is dismissing as a homogenic power and exiting in the, going down in the power of world politics, how will that affect the situation with Israel?
Israel.
Can Israel survive without the US?
Declining. How that is going to affect Israel?
Israel, yes, okay, fine. I'll be glad to talk to that.
Can I finish the question?
Sure, please.
Can Israel survive without US support? Is Israel trying to make as much gains nowadays, as we see, as possible, while it can, with the umbrella of the US still there? I'm sure they don't believe that the power of the US is leaving them. This is very important for us to know, more than the general world situation with the power of the US.
Okay, shukran. Thank you.
Okay.
We will take more questions. Yeah, John.
Thank you, Professor Wallerstein. Can you hear me? Many in the audience, I think, would be forgiven if they interpreted the conclusion of the tone, the tenor, the theme of your remarks as somewhat negative, somewhat pessimism, and a forlorn memory of better days in the past than now and those coming. To give you a counter question and ask for your response, would you consider the implications of the following? That in spite of the grounds for this pessimism, and you spelled some of them out, gifts to Iran and Afghanistan, gifts to Iran and Iraq. Iran has the best government in Baghdad it's had in modern history. In effect, America killed the country that was the zenith of Arab and Islamic civilization. And America's policies towards Palestine, which you just heard. These are morally troubling. However, one does not put all of one's eggs in one's basket. Those here need America for many reasons, and vice versa. There are close to 400,000 graduates in the GCC region from America's institutions of higher education. More than 120,000 Saudi Arabians in American universities right now. The other side of the coin, there are more than 6 American top-flight universities here in Qatar. This is revolutionary. This jumped over what used to be the Fulbright program, jumped over what used to be the junior year abroad. No other country has transformed that kind of educational exchange to this extent, and both sides benefit immensely there. Of the $14 trillion American economy, China is number 2, but America's ahead, isn't it, by at least $4 trillion. The sovereign wealth funds, these are in the trillions. Most of those are invested in the United States, and both sides benefit from that. With regard to day-to-day, we're shoulder to shoulder on counterterrorism. No two peoples are closer together in sharing real-time intelligence and more serious in their conviction and commitment on this. And not just the parties themselves benefit, but the entire world arguably benefits from this. In terms of foreign economic assistance, these are the leaders on the planet. Every year since records have been kept, Abu Dhabi, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and increasingly Qatar outpace all the rest of the world's 212 countries and the 193 in the United Nations in terms of aid for the less fortunate, compassion, and humanitarian gifts, where the United States has lowered its foreign aid to something like 0.1% of the U.S. Government. And day to day, the two of us protect not just our own interests, but the world's in terms of the sea passages and the air corridors. So bad as the relationship is from the tone, one can look at this as a glass half full or half empty. None of us are bereft of blemish, devoid of defect, free from flaw. But name any country that would not trade places with the United States to have this relationship with these countries. And name any countries that would not trade places with the GCC countries to have the relationship that exists with the United States. Please comment.
Thank you, John. Yeah, I'll take just one last question. Imad?
Thank you for the talk. What would you say about the creation of a whole set of institutions that were able to really cushion the transfer after the Second World War? And thus, I agree with what you're saying, thus the shift in systemic polarity doesn't matter, as long as the institutions that were set in place were able to take care of really the maintenance of the world system. Those are very vibrant today. Don't you see them as a means to maintain that form of of the hegemony of the system in the absence of a hegemon?
لا إذا سمحت تعطيني بس يجاوب على الأسئلة وبعدين حأنتقل لعندك.
Okay. The U.S. is not giving up. That's in fact part of the problem. President Obama wants to restore or wants to reassert U.S. leadership. And everybody applauds him for that in the United States. They all want U.S. leadership. And I often say, after the Second World War, the U.S. had to get over the isolationist thrust, which was so strong in the 1930s. And it took 30 years for the United States to incorporate in its psyche the idea that it was the hegemonic power, that it had what it, in the language that was used, it had responsibilities everywhere, okay? It's just at the point in time when they achieve this sense of popular opinion feeling, we have these responsibilities everywhere, at just that point in time, the United States power begins to go down. It's very hard for psychologically to yield the sense and the glory and the joy of being the leader, right? But you don't want to pay the price for it, so you zigzag, right? Now, the United States has alternatives. It could cease trying to be the leader. It could say, well, we're in a multipolar world and, you know, there are lots of poles of power and we have to come to compromises here and there. And you could live off your fat. A hegemonic power has a lot of fat, right? And even if the standard of living goes down by X or Y, you're not poverty-stricken. You can be fat for a long, long time after that. You just can't expend it trying to be the hegemonic power. They're not ready to do that. They have the illusion that they can restore leadership. And that's what Obama's trying to do. That's what George Bush in the last 2 years are trying to do. And that's what the next president of the United States will probably try to do, right? Whether he's a Republican or a Democrat, whether he's somewhere in the center politically or far on the far right politically, they'll try to do that, right? And that just makes the situation worse. Now, the U.S. isn't out of strengths. Being a hegemonic power gives you a lot of strength in a lot of different fields, and the U.S. still has strength in a couple. One was mentioned, education. Yes, it's true, the U.S. has, how shall I say, a very advanced, wonderful educational system, and people come from all over the world to study there. But if you look at what's happening in U.S. higher education today, that's a real problem. What's happening is U.S. higher education is running out of the money that it needs to run itself. And so what it's doing, right, is selling its stuff to non-Americans because they can charge high tuition to these people coming in, right? And they can feed their needs, right? But it transforms the system, and the system gets weaker and weaker. And in fact, it's no longer true that as many come as before, and it won't be true in the future. And Americans are beginning to go in the other direction. So yeah, we still are U.S. is still very strong in that. The U.S. currency seems to be strong. That is to say, you read every day in the Financial Times or somewhere else that despite everything that's happening, there seems to be growth in the U.S. and people are investing their money in U.S. Well, first of all, growth is a very deceptive concept, and it's not terribly important. I know that's heresy, but growth is not what matters. What matters is employment. And we don't have high employment, and it's getting worse and worse. It's getting worse and worse in the entire world, right? We're running out of customers for production, and that's why production is not being started, and there is no real investment. Now, actually, if you look at U.S. currency, it's been deflating for about 20 years. It's a third less against other currencies than it was 10, 15, 20 years ago, and it's going down. And one day, all of a sudden, and I don't know which day it is, if I did, I'd make a fortune, but on one day, it's going to go like that. Take that from me as a prediction. One day can happen next week, can happen 2 years from now, it can happen 5 years from now, but it's going to go like that. And what everybody is trying to figure out, let's take China. China is an enormous investor in U.S. Treasury bonds. And China has to say to itself, look, if we stay in, we're putting our money in something that's declining. So we put in $100 today, it's only going to be worth $80 5 years from now. That's not very smart. However, if we pull out today, right, then the U.S. doesn't have the money to buy our products. So we have to slowly, cleverly diversify and not do it a day too late or a day too early. Well, as any of you who have ever invested on the stock market, you know, there's never a way of knowing what is a day too late and a day too early, right? Somebody loses. Somebody wins, but somebody loses badly. That strength of the U.S. is also going to disappear, right? Now, does everyone want to trade places with the U.S.? Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that's true. I'm not sure that if I were a German, I would want to trade places with the U.S. today. I'm not sure if I were a Chinese, I would want to trade places with the United States. People still want the U.S., which is still strong, right, to help them. So countries say, look, I got this immediate problem. Would you give me some money? Would you send in some troops? Would you do X? And the U.S. may or may not respond to that, but they're not going to be grateful 6 months later or a year later. They're not, because U.S. presence is not desired. Iraq does not desire U.S. presence, but the present Iraqi government also needs U.S. assistance in fighting Daesh. Okay? Now, what about the institutions that were created? Well, there are several kinds of institutions. There are three economic institutions, right? There is the International Monetary Fund, there's the World Bank, and there's the World Trade Organization. Let me start with the last. The World Trade Organization they attempted to create a structure that could force countries to keep their boundaries open to U.S. and Western European investment. In 1999, at Seattle, they were unable to push this through because of popular resistance in the United States to that, okay? They have tried ever since to do it. They haven't succeeded. They never will. The World Trade Organization is an absolutely irrelevant organization. Now, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund were set up, right, to resolve certain problems between the United States and Western Europe. The International Monetary Fund was not that important until we come to the time of the slow decline of the United States. And the U.S. says to the International Monetary Fund, which they still control at that point, you have to get into the action of being the enforcers of action. And they get into that act. But the question is how long they'll be able to be an enforcer. The World Bank, which really initially was engaged in building wells here and this, that, and the other place, all of a sudden discovered about 5 years ago that there's something called poverty in the world, and they're trying to be a kind of social welfare agency. Savoskoslavo. It's worth what it's worth, right? The structures may continue to be there, but how important they are depends on a lot of other things that will follow. Things like the World Health Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and so forth, they have technical purposes if they're allowed to carry them out. And maybe they will do more of that in the future. So the international structures are relatively weak and not decisive. Now, I come to the question of the consequences for Israel and then for Iran. Israel is on a losing wicket, in my opinion. Its only real hope was the binational solution. Not the binational, two separate states, right? Using essentially the boundaries of '67. That was at one point a possibility. Israel undermined it in every way at every moment, okay? And they moved further and further and further to the right. As a result, they are for the first time losing serious support in Western Europe. They may eventually, not yet, may eventually lose support even in the United States, right? However, when they lose support, they are not going to throw up their hands because they're frightened stiff of what would happen if it became a unitary state based on majority rule. They can't imagine how they could survive, literally survive, in a state which they didn't control, the Jewish population of Israel-Palestine. And the demographics are such that they wouldn't, after a while, be able to control it. So they're going to fight to the last Israeli, okay? And they're pretty strong. They can hold on for maybe 30, 40 years. They can't hold on forever. Well, 30, 40 years from now, who knows? I mean, I'm not ready to predict what will happen in the Middle East 30 or 40 years from now. I don't see any short-term possibility that there will be some political resolution of the struggle of Israel and Palestine, or even of just Palestine. So it's a miserable situation. And is that of primary concern to you? I believe it. I think it is for most Arabs. Is it for most Arab governments? I'm not so sure, right? You know, we have an expression in English, they talk the talk, but do they walk the walk? I don't know if you understand that. The Arab governments all have a good public line on Palestine, but do they really carry it out? Some of them don't. That's all I'm ready to say on that, okay? Now, Iran. Okay. Look, Iran has the sense that it should be the regional hegemon. Okay? That's quite clear. But I want to remind you that not so long ago, in the 70s, Saudi Arabia and Iran, then the Shah's Iran, worked hand in hand to get the OPEC to raise its prices. They would not have been raised without the strong push by Saudi Arabia and Iran working together. So it's not impossible that Saudi Arabia and Iran, despite the fact that one is Sunni and one is Shiite, can work together. What happened was, of course, as you know, they had a revolution in Iran. It became a revolutionary power with an ideology and a sense of mission. And we have a socially rather conservative government in Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia saw an enormous threat from Iran, and that began to become a confessional struggle in everywhere, and it doesn't seem easy to resolve this in any way. Now, I ask you to think of yourself as Iranians for a moment, okay? You're thinking of yourself as Arabs seeing Iran and what it's doing. But if you're an Iranian, what you say to yourself is, look, there are 8 nuclear powers in the world today, and 7 of them are on our borders. The United States, Britain, France, China, India, and Israel. The only one that's not on our borders is North Korea. When we look around, we feel menaced. And maybe the way to answer a menace is by getting nuclear weapons. Now, Iran, like all your countries, has internal splits. It's very clear. The president of Iran and the president of the head of the Revolutionary Guards don't have the same view of what Iran's policy ought to be. And there's one man who is deciding which policy it should be, and he seems to wiggle. That's my reading of it. He wiggles. But, you know, because everybody's trying to maintain their head above water internally. Okay? So they go back and forth, and they negotiate with the U.S., but their terms are stiff. The U.S. negotiates with them, but if the terms are stiff, can they come to an agreement? Do both sides really want an agreement? All good questions. Right? It's all very uncertain. You know? That's what I have to underline. The uncertainty is in everybody's pocket, and that's the difficult thing for all of us to live with.
Thank you. One last round of questions. Khalid, تفضل.
Well, thank you very much. My quick 3 points or questions are one to do with the very, let's say, major theory or paradigm, so to speak, that you have been writing about, the world system thing. Do you have, after maybe 3 or 4 decades of starting this project, any elements of the theory that you think they need to be revisited or reviewed?
I think the theory needs to be revisited.
The second thing is to do with the internal dynamics and politics with the states in terms of their decline or rise. You haven't mentioned anything to do with, let's say, democracy, any democratic system, any reform, or the authoritarian nature of different states, and whether this internal nature affects the quick, let's say, decline or slow decline of any given state. And the very last one is to do with Russia and China. In today's politics, you have described the US as a loose cannon. What do you think of, do you have any metaphor to describe China or Russia to that matter? Thank you.
Ustazi, excuse me. You have been raising your hand for quite some time, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I had this question is in the background of what the distinguished speaker talked about, the decline of the United States since 1970 onwards. What is your estimate of how long the United States of America will remain united? And if it is not going to split into 50 states, how do you see the north, south, east, west divide? Thank you.
بس المايك إذا سمحت بالأخير.
Yeah, thank you. My question has to do with internal politics in the U.S. Race, would race become another problem for the U.S.? The case of Ferguson, the jury not indicting white policemen for the killing of 2 blacks. Really, is that a growing problem in the U.S.? Is race a growing problem in the U.S.? It's not clear.
Could you please repeat that question?
Well, I think it was clear. Yeah, I was clear enough really. No, the question is about the issue of race in the U.S. Racial divide. The jury not indicting 2 white policemen for the Ferguson and the case in New York. Really, could that really add to the demise and to the problems facing the U.S.? Thank you.
Could that lead to hasten the demise of the United States? Okay.
Does world system theory need to be revisited? Well, I kind of revisit it each day. I've been doing that for 50-odd years. But I think it explains more of current reality than any competing explanation. And so the basic premises of world systems analysis seem to me to be as valid as they've ever been. So one day they may be the end of that. In fact, I've even written an article called The Rise and Future Demise of World Systems Analysis, but we haven't gotten to that demise yet. Now, look, Russia and China, are they loose cannons too? Well, in some sense, everybody has uncertainties. China, the government seems to me to have a very clear set of priorities. And priority number one is to see the country remain a single country. China has a long history of being broken up, and it only overcame the latest breakup of China with the coming to power of the Chinese Communist Party. And they really worry about pieces, chunks, pulling away. It explains an awful lot about what they do. So far, they've been very successful at that. Furthermore, their diplomacy is not perfect, but it's pretty good. And they have been improving their relations with an awful lot of countries. Now, can they make mistakes? Yeah, they get a little carried away with their angers over Japan and its history with them, and they can go too far every once in a while. But they pull back, you know. Notice that. Russia's a little less stable than China. And, you know, Putin is the last of a long series of Russian strongmen, going all the way back to Ivan the Terrible. And he's worried about the breakup of Russia. He's also worried about the fact that it's not taken seriously as a world power. And he set himself the objective of restoring its role, not as hegemonic power in the world, but as one of the countries whose views have to be taken into account. He's not done badly. His maneuvering has been quite successful. And I predict that within a couple of years, he and Germany will have made a deal about stability in Europe, and it will prevail. Exactly the details of that, I'm not sure, but I mean, what Russia wants is that NATO not be on their borders, and what Mrs. Merkel wants is that the Ukraine minus Crimea, the rest of the Ukraine, remain a united state, and I think we'll end up with that probability. Now, the U.S., internal composition of the state, will it remain united? What about racial discrimination? Look, another thing I've argued for an awful long time is that the United States is not a model of stability internally. And it's much worse than it used to be. The United States is torn apart at the moment, and there's no sign that this will end. Right? It's getting worse, not better. And it may take more violent versions internally. And certainly racial discrimination, if you want to call it that, racism is a major factor in that, but it's not the only factor. So if you ask me, will the U.S. remain united? I'm not sure. I'm not sure that it's as likely to remain united as China is likely, or even Russia is likely to remain united. That's one of its problems today in attempting to play the role of a leader. If Obama decides that from the U.S. point of view, it doesn't make sense to send ground troops into Syria, what happens internally in the United States? Do they really debate that issue with him? No. There's one group that says, listen, the U.S. can't be a leader unless it sends troops on the ground. That isn't an enormous faction, but it's there. It's there. It has a big spokesman in McCain, right? Who the joke is never saw a war he didn't like, okay? But there are other people who oppose Obama simply to oppose Obama, not because they don't like a particular thing he's proposing, but just on principle, right? And they scream and yell at him. Now, you know, the Republican Party is split, the Democratic Party is split, and all the people who are outside the parties are split. And they're split in different ways. And it's paralyzing. That's one of the problems the U.S. has today. They are, in my view, relatively paralyzed, right? Which is why I call them the loose cannon, because when you're paralyzed, you can get pushed. The boat can tip. And they're still the most powerful. If their boat tips, a lot of people tip with it. And we all tip with it, basically. So it's dangerous. It's dangerous. And we have to navigate the next 20, 30 years in this very dangerous situation.
We have one last but very legitimate question. I think so many people are still here with us today because they want to hear an answer to it. And شكرا للدكتور خالد عبد القادر, who asks, what are the implications of the U.S. decline on the GCC future, or the future of the GCC?
I don't know, because the GCC future is a function of what goes on throughout the Middle East. Can't be separated from knowing what Turkey does, what Iran does, what Egypt does, what even Algeria does, and certainly what Syria, Iraq, and so forth do. You can't just look at the GCC. So, you know, it has a geopolitical function, right? Of holding this set of countries to a fairly common policy and a zone of relative stability. But you have your strains. There's a strain between Qatar and the other GCC countries. There are other strains. There's a strain between Oman and the UAE. it may survive, but 20 years from now, we may not even know the word GCC because there's been some kind of restructuring of Middle Eastern boundaries and alliances and so forth. So for the moment, you're relatively wealthy, relatively peaceful, relatively coherent, but 5 years from now, 10 years from now, I don't know. And I hope you do.
شكرا جزيلا. أنا شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you indeed so much. Thank you so much for these insights. I think there are a lot of questions that some were expecting to get answers. They haven't gotten answers, especially the last question, because I think there will not be in any day a theory able to explain everything in the international system and to predict everything. Otherwise, this defies the logic of policy or the international system. And we cannot say that will not be any crisis or any war in this case. So I think that Professor was accurate when he says, I don't know, because in many times you don't really know about the changes taking place here or there with a speed that is unpredicted. I think Daesh or ISIS has surprised everybody in Iraq, even the Americans themselves. So we thank you indeed, Professor Wallerstein, for this enriching dialogue which has taken us in a sphere of so many issues relevant to the researchers of this region and its issues. We thank you, Professor, and we thank everybody for being patient with us. We thank Professor Wallerstein. Thank you indeed. Thank you all so much.